and they'd point to me, and they wouldn't say, Angie, this is Corporal Grosso. Yeah. And although I was in it so very little because it was all of the men doing the robbery.
At 93, Angie Dickinson shocked Hollywood when she unexpectedly mentioned Randolph Scott, the man she hadn't spoken of even once in 70 years. No one could have imagined that inside the actress's drawer was still an old photograph of her with Scott. A picture she had carried with her for more than half a century. And in her latest interview, she softly said, "There are memories that don't need to be told, only remembered." That seemingly ordinary sentence sent the media into a frenzy. For between Angie Dickinson, the symbol of beauty and power in Hollywood, and Randolph Scott, the cold, stoic leading man of the Westerns, there had never been any confirmation of a relationship between them. So what made her, after nearly a century of living in the spotlight, suddenly decide to speak his name? To understand the story behind those three words, Randolph Scott, we must go back to 1957, when a young woman first stepped onto a movie set in her life and accidentally met the man she would remember for the rest of her days. Before the name Angie Dickinson shone brightly on Hollywood's Walk of Fame, she was simply Angeline Brown, a small-town girl born in a wooden house in Coulomb, North Dakota, in the autumn of 1931. The town had only a few streets wines that blew all year and snow that blanketed everything every winter. Her father was a journalist. Her mother, a gentle woman, once told her, "If you want people to listen, speak from the heart." Perhaps that was when Angie learned to see the world through the eyes of a storyteller. While other children played with dolls, she would stand in front of the mirror, holding a comb as a microphone, mimicking the voice of her father's radio announcer. That clear, melodic voice echoed through the small kitchen, a sound no one could have imagined would one day enchant all of Hollywood. Her childhood passed peacefully until 1942, when the world was at war. The Brown family moved to Burbank, California, a small city right next to the heart of the movie industry. On the very first afternoon there, Angie looked up at the glowing movie billboards, the neon-lit theaters, and the actors in tailored suits hurrying past. The 10-year-old girl suddenly felt the world was dazzling and as distant as a dream. Time went by, and Angie grew up between two worlds, the simplicity of North Dakota and the glamour of California. After graduating from Burbank High School, she attended Glendale College and later worked as a secretary for a small airline in Los Angeles. She thought her life would pass quietly like any other woman's until one summer afternoon in 1953, when fate appeared in the form of a local beauty contest. Her friends urged her to join just for fun. Angie hesitated, saying, "I'm not made for the spotlight." But she still wore the pale blue dress her mother had sewn, stepping onto the stage amid music and applause. She didn't win the crown, but her shy smile and confident eyes were captured by a photographer, a photo that appeared in a Los Angeles newspaper a few days later. And just a week after that, a letter with the Warner Brothers studio seal arrived at her home. When Angie held the envelope, her hands trembled. Warner Brothers, those 4 italicized letters, felt like a call from another world. She stayed silent for a long moment, then folded her coat, tucked the Bible her mother had given her into her suitcase, and boarded the earliest train to Los Angeles. That morning, as the train pulled away from Burbank Station, the June sunlight streamed through the window, falling across the face of a 21-year-old girl, her eyes filled with fear and excitement, as if she already sensed her life had just turned a new page. Angie's first morning on the Warner Brothers backlot in Burbank in 1957 was drenched in golden light sunlight, spilling over rows of wooden facades built to resemble a dusty western town. The air buzzed with the noise of the crew, the clatter of the cameras, the scent of dry earth, and the rhythmic pounding of horses' hooves, a world unlike anything she had ever known. Angie, 26 years old and freshly resigned from her secretary job for a small supporting role in Shootout at Medicine Bend, stood nervously beside a wooden crate, clutching her crumpled script. Her shirt was dusty, her hair tousled by the wind, and her heart beat so fast she was afraid to breathe too loudly. Amid the chaos, a deep voice spoke behind her, making her jump. "Don't be scared. Cameras don't bite." The voice was low, calm, and warm enough to still all the noise around her for an instant. Angie turned and met a gaze she would never forget. The man stood tall and broad-shouldered, his hair touched with gray, his face rugged yet refined, and his eyes bright but distant. He wore the trademark brown jacket of Western heroes, standing beneath a shaft of morning light that slanted through the wooden awning. She didn't need an introduction to know this was Randolph Scott, one of Hollywood's greatest stars, the man the newspapers called the Gentleman of the West. He was nearly 30 years her senior, famous for his composure, his quiet nature, and a sense of discipline that inspired both respect and fear. That day, he said nothing more, just gave her a small nod before walking away. But for Angie, that moment carved itself into her memory. She stood still, feeling her heart pound so fast it seemed everyone around could hear it. Throughout the day's filming, she kept making mistakes, missing her marks, forgetting lines, dropping props. The director frowned, the assistants sighed, and she blushed deeply, trying to hide her trembling hands. When the third scene had to be reshot for the fourth time, she was on the verge of tears. Then he walked over, said nothing, and simply placed a strong hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. "Everyone stumbles a few times before they learn to ride." That simple sentence felt like a hand reaching through the storm. His voice was deep and steady, laced with that thick southern drawl, as if he were speaking to an old friend, not a young actress he had just met. From that day on, he often stood closer whenever they shared a scene. He showed her how to hold a gun naturally, how to walk like it mattered. Whenever she flubbed a line, he didn't laugh, he just looked at her, and that look alone was enough for her to know what needed fixing. No words were needed. That gaze, stern, gentle, and strangely safe, said everything. At noon, while the crew took a break, Angie sat under the wooden awning, eating a quick sandwich, the air heavy with summer heat. From afar, she saw him sitting alone, leaning against a post, his eyes on the painted desert backdrop beyond the lot. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and the thin smoke curled into the light. He looked so calm, it made the world feel still. She stole glances, and when their eyes met, he just nodded, a faint smile flickering across his lips like smoke. Neither said a word, But in that instant, she knew some invisible thread had quietly tied them together. Day by day, the air between them began to change. In every scene they shared, the connection was so natural that the director once exclaimed, "You two look like you've forgotten there's a camera." Angie laughed, though her heart trembled because she knew those feelings were no longer part of the script. Once, during a campfire scene, he leaned closer and asked softly, "Are you afraid of the lights?" "No," she replied. "I'm just afraid I won't feel real enough." He smiled that rare, fleeting smile that softened his normally stern face. "Really? Then just be real." She never noticed when the director called cut. Their eyes stayed locked, and perhaps from that moment on, the line between acting and truth dissolved completely. Rumors soon rippled through the crew. Some said they were getting close, others shrugged. "He just likes the new girl." But everyone saw the change in Randolph Scott. He drank less, smiled more, and whenever filming paused, he always found a reason to linger a little longer. As for Angie, every time he came near her, heart raced like it had that very first day on set. Summer passed. When Shootout at Medicine Bend wrapped its final scene on the mock desert near Mojave, the sun blazed down, burning the horizon. The director shouted. Cut applause erupted, props were packed, and the crew celebrated. Angie turned to look for him, but the spot where he'd been standing was empty. No goodbye, no last glance. Only the swirling red dust rising in the wind, and the sound of the prop house door closing. She stood there for a long time, hollow and motionless. Everything that had happened felt like a brief dream. And when she woke, she was just the same young woman, standing alone in a vast studio lot, her heart missing something she couldn't even name. When Shootout at Medicine Bend premiered in early 1958, Hollywood praised Randolph Scott's cold, proud Western charm, the ageless cowboy. No one noticed the young woman beside him in a few fleeting scenes, the one whose eyes looked so real they made the audience believe she was truly in love. Angie, sitting in a Los Angeles theater that night, felt her chest tighten as his face appeared on screen. The light that flickered across his features, cold, distant, and heartbreakingly beautiful, was the very space that separated them. After the screening, Angie returned to her small apartment on Melrose Avenue, the one she had rented since her first days in the city. The room had only a small bed, a vanity, and a window overlooking the city lights. On the table beside a pile of old scripts, an envelope had been slipped under the door. She opened it. Inside the side was a photograph of the two of them during a lunch break at the Warner Brothers lot. In the photo, he sat beside her, holding his cowboy hat, while she looked down, her hair tousled by the wind. On the back, written in his unmistakable slanted handwriting, were the words, "For the days that should have been longer." She sat still reading those 8 words over and over until she could recite them by heart. Each time, she did something tightened in her throat, a longing too fragile to name. She never replied, never told anyone. She simply folded the photo, placed it in the drawer of her bedside table, and locked it. From that night on, her small Melrose apartment held one more secret. In the months that followed, Angie threw herself into auditions, line practice, expression training, trying to forget. But every time she passed through the gates of Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, she would glance up at the golden letters above the iron archway, and her heart would clench. Sometimes, when the cameras lit up, she would instinctively search for that familiar gaze somewhere beyond the lenses. It wasn't there. He was gone, just as the men in westerns always leave town when the story ends quietly, without ever looking back. In May 1958, newspapers reported that Randolph Scott had announced his retirement after completing a few more projects. He bought a small ranch in Beverly Hills and rarely appeared in public again. Angie, meanwhile, though still a newcomer, began receiving offers for a series of small roles. Hollywood started to take notice of the girl with speaking eyes that gaze, which felt so hauntingly real on screen. She would smile whenever people asked, "Where did you study acting to have such a sad look in your eyes?" She only replied, "I didn't study. I just remember." In the years that followed, the letters, invitations, and casting contracts came one after another. Yet inside the small drawer of her Melrose apartment, that photograph still lay there untouched, unknown to anyone. She took it with her every time she moved, when she later settled in the Hollywood Hills, when fame and fortune finally came her way. And each time she opened that drawer and saw the handwriting on the back, Angie would smile faintly, the smile of someone who had once touched something beautiful, but knew that if she ever reached for it again, it would disappear. For years, Angie was seen beside many of Hollywood's leading men: Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, each rumored to be romantically linked with her. Yet strangely, among all the names that were repeated over and over, she never once mentioned Randolph Scott. It was as if he had never existed in her life. One evening in 1962, while sitting in a small bar on Sunset Boulevard with a few friends, someone casually brought up Scott. "He's old. Now they say he lives a very quiet life." Angie looked up slightly, her lips trembling. "Really?" She asked just that one word, soft as a breath. The table fell silent. Then she smiled, raised her glass, and said calmly, "He deserves peace." No one asked again. From then on, Angie rarely spoke about the past. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the city was asleep, she would open the drawer and take out that old photograph. The warm lamplight would fall across two faces, a Western hero who had already ridden off, and a young woman just stepping into life. Everything was frozen in that moment, in that frame, in silence. In the years following Shootout, at Medicine Bend, Hollywood changed rapidly. Westerns slowly gave way to a new era of cinema. Yet for Angie Dickinson, it was when every door seemed to open. In 1959, she appeared in Rio Bravo alongside John Wayne and Dean Martin, two names any young actress would dream of sharing the screen with. Her role as Feathers, the smart, alluring, and daring woman, made Angie Dickinson a star overnight. From a clumsy girl, she became Hollywood's newest icon, not for her flawless beauty, but for the eyes that could laugh, ache, and hide something untouchable. The 1960s were her golden decade. In 1960, Angie starred in Ocean's 11 with Frank Sinatra, a film that catapulted her to A-list status and tied her name to the legendary Rat Pack Hollywood's most charming rebels. She had everything a woman could dream of: fame, wealth, glamorous parties in Las Vegas, and the attention of the most powerful men in the industry. But amidst the laughter and the lights, Angie kept one habit: driving home alone after every party, playing soft jazz, and stopping at the same intersection where the red light washed over her face in silence. She once told a friend, "I like red lights. They're like Hollywood beautiful, but no one's allowed to cross." By 1965, at 34, Angie married Burt Bacharach, the genius composer behind Raindrops Keep Fallin' on My Head. Their wedding took place in Las Vegas, surrounded by flashing cameras and well-wishes from the entire entertainment world. They were hailed as the golden couple of the decade, a man who wrote songs for the world to sing, and a woman who could make the world stop just by walking past. Yet behind the glossy Life and Vogue magazine covers, their marriage slowly turned into a melody with too many sad notes. Bacharach belonged to the stage, to concert nights, endless tours, and whispered affairs the tabloids only half reported. Angie, after long days on set, returned to a house where only the ticking clock kept her company. In one interview, she once said, "I can play a strong woman on screen, but when I get home, I just want someone to ask, 'Are you okay?'" It sounded like a casual remark, but those who knew her understood it was the echo of a loneliness that had lasted for years. By the mid-1970s, Angie reached new heights as Pepper Anderson in Policewoman, the first American TV series to feature a female police officer as the lead. From 1974 to 1978, millions of Americans tuned in to see the strong woman who could take down criminals and still keep a warm heart. Pepper Anderson not only made Angie a beloved television icon, but also paved the way for generations of actresses to come. But even in those dazzling years, darkness crept in. Her only daughter, Nikki Bacharach, born in 1966, was diagnosed with autism and required special care. Angie balanced filming with motherhood and the growing distance of a husband who was slowly slipping away. The marriage eventually broke, but she never spoke bitterly of it. In a later interview, she said simply, "He was a beautiful song. I just sang off-key." In 1995, when Nikki passed away at 29, Angie nearly vanished from Hollywood. No press conferences, no farewells. She just withdrew quietly. The media called it the most heartbreaking silence in American television history. After the funeral, she was seen sitting alone by the shore in Santa Monica, gazing at the horizon with a cup of cold coffee in hand. When a reporter approached and asked, "Are you afraid of being alone?" she smiled gently and said, "No. I'm only afraid of forgetting what it feels like to miss someone." That line left everyone speechless, because behind her smile, there was still something that had never been spoken. In the years that followed, Angie appeared rarely, attending only a few major events or tributes to old friends. She remained beautiful, graceful, but her eyes carried a faraway sadness, as if she were always living between two worlds, one of glamour and one of memories she could never touch again. And whenever someone asked, of all the men who've passed through your life, who do you remember most? She would just smile, a soft, misty smile, and reply, There was one, but he belongs to another world. No one dared to ask further, because even when her answer was only half a truth, everyone could feel the rest was something words could never reach. In her final years, Angie Dickinson lived quietly in a small house in Beverly Hills, far from the lights and noise of Hollywood. She rarely appeared in public, attending only a few tribute events for old friends, always with that gentle smile and distant gaze, as if she were looking at something only she could see. Family members said that in her living room, there was always an old wooden box sitting on the table. She often opened it in the late afternoons, sat silently for a long time, and then smiled faintly. No one knew what was inside, thinking it was just a collection of career mementos. Until later, people realized that among the photos from film sets, there was one picture that never faded. A photograph taken with Randolph Scott in 1957. In one of her rare interviews at the age of 90, when asked why she had never spoken about her past, she simply replied, "Not every memory needs to be told. Some are meant only to be remembered." That sentence echoed softly and then dissolved into silence. The kind of silence that belongs to someone who has lived a full life but still kept a small corner for herself. And perhaps at 93, she finally realized that staying silent too long can also be a kind of sorrow. Late afternoon in Studio City, Los Angeles, sunlight filled the small studio yard, warm and calm, like the closing of a long day. When the door opened, every gaze turned toward the silver-haired woman who walked in, her steps slow, yet her elegance still carrying the charm that once made her a Hollywood icon. At 93, Angie Dickinson still had that strangely clear gaze, the one that once made the whole world fall silent whenever she appeared on screen. She sat down in the chair at the center of the set, a small wooden table in front of her. On it, she gently placed an object, an old dark brown wooden box, its corners worn, its clasp rusted, a companion that had followed her for almost an entire lifetime. The crew had prepared everything for a special recording, a conversation dedicated to the legends who had lived through Hollywood's golden era. Everyone thought she would talk about her memories with Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, or Burt Bacharach. No one expected that inside that box lay a memory that had never been told. The host asked softly, his voice cautious, "Of all the men who have passed through your life, who is the one you remember most?" The question fell lightly, like a breath, yet the air suddenly thickened. Angie didn't answer right away. Her thin, frail hands trembled slightly as she opened the box, as if afraid that if she opened it too quickly, what was inside might vanish. Inside were a few photos from film sets, a note written in fountain pen, and a faded black and white photograph. She lifted it carefully with both hands. In the picture, sunlight spilled across the wooden awning of the Warner Brothers backlot in Burbank, the place where in 1957 a young Angie Dickinson had first stepped onto a film set. In the corner of the frame sat a man broad-shouldered, holding a cowboy hat, his eyes gazing into the distance. It was Randolph Scott, the legendary Western actor. Between them was a space only an arm's length apart, far enough to be proper, but close enough for the heart to sense what was never said. On the back, the blue ink had faded with time, for the days that should have been longer, for the days that should have been longer. She gently traced her finger across the words, her voice trembling but clear. Some memories don't need to be told, only remembered. But sometimes, to find peace, you still have to speak the thing you've kept your whole life. No one in the studio dared to breathe. The soft, yellow light touched her face, illuminating the fine lines like delicate threads. Then she spoke slowly, evenly, every syllable, just enough for the camera to catch Randolph Scott. Those two words fell into the air like a soft chime ringing through an empty room. No one said a thing. No one moved. It was the kind of silence that belongs to things sacred. She placed the photograph back into the box, closing the lid gently, like someone tucking away a part of her life. The host asked quietly, almost in a whisper, "Would you like to say anything more?" She smiled a calm smile, the smile of someone who had just set down a burden carried for half a century. "No, that's enough." Outside, the Los Angeles sky was deepening into dusk. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, laying a soft halo across her face, like the final light of a movie's closing scene. In that room, everyone stayed silent, for they all understood some loves last the longest when they are never made public. And some names, only when spoken one final time, can finally rest in peace. Late afternoon in Studio City, Los Angeles, sunlight spread a thin layer of gold across the warm pavement and the reflector boards standing by the studio gates. The door opened slowly, and she walked in, small, graceful, her hair white as mist, her eyes still clear, shimmering with that quiet pride that only those who have once stood under the brightest lights possess. At 93, Angie Dickinson was no longer the starlet of the 60s, but she still carried an aura that made the entire room fall still the moment she appeared. She sat down, gently placing the old wooden box on the table. The bee was dark brown, its paint chipped, its clasp dull and worn as though her hands had touched it thousands of times through the years. The crew prepared for the special recording, a conversation honoring Hollywood's old legends. Everyone thought she would speak about Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, or the glorious days filming Policewoman. No one expected that inside that box was a memory she had never once spoken aloud. When the cameras lit up, the host smiled softly, his voice low and cautious. "Of all the men who have passed through your life, who is the one you remember most?" The question simple. As it was made, the air grew still. Angie didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, her gaze drifting far from the present, and slowly opened the box. Her frail hands trembled lightly, as if afraid the memories inside would dissolve if she opened it too quickly. Inside were a few photos from old film sets, a note written in fountain pen, and a faded black and white photograph. She lifted it carefully, and as the light reflected off the glass, the image suddenly came alive. In it was the wooden porch of Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, where in the summer of 1957, the young Angie Dickinson had been given her first role. Beside her was a tall, broad-shouldered man with deep eyes, Randolph Scott, the embodiment of the Western hero. He sat slightly turned, holding his cowboy hat while she looked down, a faint smile on her lips. Between them was a distance just wide enough for courtesy, yet close enough to make one's heart ache. On the back, the blue ink had blurred with time, for the days that should have been longer. For the days that should have been longer. She gently ran her fingers over the words, her voice low and steady, just clear enough for the recorder to catch. Some memories don't need to be told, only remembered. But sometimes, to find peace, one still has to speak what has been hidden a whole lifetime. No one in the studio dared to breathe. The warm, yellow light touched her face, the deep wrinkles glowing faintly, like old film being played in reverse. Then she spoke slowly, evenly, each word measured, as if weighed by her heart, Randolph Scott. The two words fell into the air like a bell echoing in an empty hall. No music, no applause, only silence, the thick sacred kind that belongs to things truly holy. Angie placed the photograph back into the box and closed the lid softly. The host whispered, "Would you like to say anything more?" She shook her head slightly, her smile as thin as a thread, calm as someone who had finally set down a burden. Carried for half a century, no. That's enough. Outside, the Los Angeles sky turned to dusk, sunlight slipping through the blinds and painting her face in a dim golden glow, like the final light of a film's closing scene. No one on the crew said a word because they all understood some loves last the longest when they are never made public. And some names, only when spoken one last time, can finally rest in peace. Randolph Scott had passed away in 1987, taking with him an entire era of cinema, in which he had been a symbol. Near 90, he left the world as quietly as he had lived. No scandals, no grand farewells, just a few short newspaper notices, and a handful of old friends leaving flowers at the gate of his Beverly Hills home. Hollywood mourned him for a moment, then moved on, as it always does, with its legends. Only one person somewhere among the hills of Los Angeles kept a space for him in her memory. Angie Dickinson lived many more years through countless springs, autumns, and winters in her small house overlooking the valley. In the mornings, she made coffee. In the afternoons, she read old scripts. Sometimes she played a song by Burt Bacharach, her former husband, the man who had written the melodies of her youth. Yet, within those melodies, she always heard a quiet pause, a wordless space where the memory of a man on horseback in the western plains still flickered softly in her heart. Her family said that on sleepless nights, she would sit on the porch gazing at the glowing city below. The lights of Los Angeles reflected off her silver hair, shimmering like old film reels, replaying inside her mind. When someone once asked, "Do you still remember him?" she smiled gently and said, "I do, but not sadly. Because if I were sad, he wouldn't rest in peace." The life of a woman who had lived nearly a century, who had stood at the height of fame, endured marriages, losses, and hundreds of roles, finally came down to a single photograph, a single line of writing, and two simple words of a name. She once said, "I have learned to love to lose to rise again. But there's one thing I have never learned to forget." Now, in the old room where she once filmed that interview, the wooden box still rests quietly, on the table, a silent witness to a love that never had a name. No one has opened it since. But people like to believe that if one day Hollywood ever grows quiet and only the wind whispers through the windows, you might hear her voice, soft and clear. Thank you for showing me what was real. Outside, the Los Angeles sun sank slowly behind the buildings, leaving the horizon awash in red. The light reflected off the window pane, just like the final frame of a film that needs no ending. A life on screen came to a close, not with applause, but with silence. And one final belated thank you, the most beautiful farewell of all. Perhaps after all of the roles, the parties, and the endless filming seasons, what remained in Angie Dickinson's life was neither fame nor glory, but a memory, a fragment so small it could fit perfectly inside an old wooden box. She kept it for more than half a century, the way someone guards the truest part of themselves after years of living behind 100 different faces. When speaking of Randolph Scott at 93, she wasn't seeking love again, nor offering explanations. She only wanted to say a thank you that had gone unsaid to the man who had passed through her life as lightly as the wind, yet left a mark that never faded. There are stories that don't need to be told, many times only remembered. There are names that don't need to be shouted, thousands of times only spoken once, at the right moment, to the right person, and that alone is enough to make the world fall silent. If you too believe that behind every legend lies a heart that can love, hurt, stay silent, and forgive, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so we can go deeper into the untold stories where the lights fade and their true selves finally come into view.